Hello, everybody. It is John Pollock and Wai Ting. We're doing a special bonus show today. Of course, it's been a very tragic week in the industry of professional wrestling. We were talking on Wednesday about the passing of the legendary Terry Funk, and today we are back to talk about the very untimely death of Windham Rotunda, better known as Bray Wyatt. Stunning news for everybody. On Thursday, we had known that he had been off WWE programming since February and had been kept relatively quiet about what he was dealing with. And it was Sean Ross Sapp that reported the news that he suffered a heart attack on Thursday and had been battling heart issues that came as a result of COVID, that he had been off television since. As you recall, back in February, he was already starting his WrestleMania program with Bobby Lashley, and then there was confusion over whether that program would continue or not. It did not. And the latest we had heard on the status of Windham Rotunda was a comment by his father, Mike Rotunda, to Bill Apter over SummerSlam weekend that at least provided some optimism that he would hopefully be returning soon. And it just seemed to be a question of when, not if, he would be returning, and obviously nothing that is going to prepare you for the type of news that we received late Thursday afternoon, early Thursday evening. It's a very difficult story to process, Way, but I mean, you've had some time to, I guess, digest the news. Obviously, everybody is in mourning over just a very tragic story, and I mean, this is a 36-year-old father of four, and it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, 100%. Um, so again, like anytime one of these tragedies happens in professional wrestling, it, it's strange because like on the one hand, it's it's awful. On the other hand, it's like we I feel like as a community we've gone through these things, especially like if you're a longtime fan. But it still doesn't really diminish, I guess, like
I think it is
how
different now,
awful it
Way,
is.
because with the propensity of the immediacy to interact with people. I mean, when I look back at, like, even though you had various social media that existed, it wasn't to this extent, like where we were going through, like in the late 90s or through the 2000s, where there is so much more of like a public forum that people can openly mourn these individuals, and you just see like how um significant it is when you see like the industry kind of stops when one of these stories occurs.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's awful every single time. And I just in a case like this, when it's shocking, when it's completely, um, I guess we no none of us really had any warning or any expectation of something like this happening. Um, it's really hard to process. And sorry if this is not the smoothest audio, but it's still really hard for me to process it right now. Um, I think beyond just even, thinking about his creative contributions, it's just the knowledge that, he'll never be able to see his children again, and his children will never be able to see him, and his fiance will never be able to see him, and his father, his siblings, you know. That's immediately now what I start to think about.
Yeah, I mean, this was somebody that was, you know, we were making like the comparison to like a Terry Funk that was born into this industry. His father, his grandfather, you had his brother, his uncles, Barry Windham, Kendall Windham. I mean, this was a wrestling family, and one that, I mean, this individual, I mean, he sought out like he was a very good athlete in high school and college doing football. He also did he was a state champion in wrestling in high school as well. And then, he redshirted in university. He went to two different schools and then was on a team at Troy University. And at the end of the 2008 season, that's when he gave his notice and he just went full bore into professional wrestling. And I think that's where, like, you look at him as a relatively like newer character, but when you think about the fact that here was someone that's been in the WWE system for 14 plus years, Like, and this, like, to me, part of the just writing all about him last night and this morning is like the story of Windham Rotunda in terms of the pro wrestling side of him. It's one of constant struggle. Like, this was not someone that just had this smooth ride to the top. He had multiple highs, multiple lows. There was division among the character itself, and it just seemed always trying to find this perfect balance that was going to ultimately click and become this big main event level character for the company. And he went through so many iterations of the Bray Wyatt character. You go back to when he was Husky Harris as part of the NXT, and just going under Duke Rotunda in Florida Championship Wrestling. Like, he went through so many different versions. And that, to me, is part of the story of this guy who was, I think, extremely creatively gifted. I think you can take that away from just his work from the outside looking in and from those that worked with him, but also being able to get that extreme creativity out in a system that sometimes like is more regimented. And like, that's a huge part of Bray Wyatt to me, is looking at this guy that was constantly retooling this character. And one of those highs was that return last year when he became like, they had that great campaign behind his return, and then coming in, and he was a difference maker on television for those first couple of weeks. Like, you saw attendance go up, you saw television numbers go up. And you watch that first return speech that he gave in New Orleans right after his return at Extreme Rules. I mean, it's chilling to listen to it today, as I did. But then, you go into the character itself, and it was kind of the supernatural elements that some loved, some hated, and it was always trying to strike that balance. And it seemed to be, constant retooling and trying to find the magic formula.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe just even taking it back to, the very beginning, or at least, his on-screen beginning from when he kind of came on my radar, at least, that season of NXT where it was like the contest, and he came out with a terrible name, Husky Harris, and Mike Rotunda's son, that was really the guy's identity at that point. Bit of a
You remember who his pro was?
No, who?
Cody Rhodes.
Oh, interesting. There
Yeah.
you go. So, they did the new Nexus with him in it, and Michael McGillicuddy, and I don't even know if I heard the guy cut a promo once. I don't know how often I would have even heard him talk at all. So made no
I mean, he was
impression.
as close to a Spirit Squad type of write-off at the end of that, like in the Nexus. Like, Randy Orton punted him all the way back to Florida Championship Wrestling. Like, it was, he was brought up to the main roster, and it was only several months with the new Nexus, and boom, he's gone. And it was the thought of like, will we see this guy again? And it took him some time. It was like a year later that he crafts the Bray Wyatt character, and that the Bray Wyatt character to me is very synonymous with the advent of NXT. Like, here is a repackaged individual that had a short but failed run on the main roster. And here is something that those introductory vignettes on NXT television, like, that was legitimate buzz that people got. Like, these are very different from your typical WWE videos with like the inspiration from Cape Fear. That this was and I think the fact that you had this contrast, like, many people, their last image of him was Husky Harris, and now a transformation that drew people in, and seeing the NXT version and then moving it up to the main roster, and that had its growing pains.
Yeah, I mean, to call it a makeover, I think would be a big understatement. If anything, it felt like, like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, and being this full, complete expression of a character that clearly existed within this man's mind this entire time, but was just like dying to break out. And you see this like incredibly fully formed thing that, we're talking about developmental here. We're talking about guys that probably for the most part haven't had that much experience, cutting promos. This felt like a character that was already fully fleshed out, deeper than most what you would see on the main roster. And the vignettes, of course, the production behind them was very, very strong. The look and the
Just like
style of the promo.
handheld, like very simple, basic, and that was like such a contrast at the time.
And I have no doubt, like, yeah, he probably worked with some very talented people to help execute it, but I have no doubt a lot of that, the aesthetic sort of like identity around everything between the way he dressed, of course, the way he spoke, but also the way those things looked. I'm sure a lot of it might be credited to him, just knowing how much of a creative mind this guy ended up being. I think, maybe if he wasn't born, the son of a wrestler, he might have become a great filmmaker or great actor or something else. But wrestling was lucky enough to have a very unique mind who was not afraid to take risks.
Yeah, and that's what this was. Like there was no guarantee that this was going to find its audience. And it struggled. Like that is like you can't hide from the fact like it was always a struggle with this Bray Wyatt character, but you also have to remember the time period when they're introducing the Wyatt family. It's not like Florida Championship Wrestling and the migration to NXT. It's not like it was the NXT of several years in the future where it became like the hot thing to watch and they were coming up with all these they were signing up all the indie stars and coming up with these characters. Like it was a pretty cookie cutter developmental that was not all that inspiring when there was a big concern about what's the next generation of talent going to be coming out of this system. That Florida Championship Wrestling, like for those that went through that system, it was a far cry from what you see today. And the fact that this is the WWE developmental system in Florida that famously had no bathroom in it when they first started off at that facility. And then you start to have something like this that at least catches people's attention as something different. And, they spend their time in NXT and then are slowly brought up with WWE style vignettes in 2013. And they come up and it was the first act, I would say, because the Shield was not an act in NXT. Like they were all individuals that were put together. I consider that like a WWE act of sort of your FCW parts. But the Wyatt act, like that was to me the first major act that came from developmental in its form. It's not like we're calling them up and giving them all new characters. We were taking something that clicked on a small level and let's extrapolate it to national television. And thus it came up and there was instant interest in this group and seeing how they would fare. And it was hit and miss out of the gate. They had a program with Kane. They got involved with CM Punk and Daniel Bryan. Like you could see, like they were designed to be a top group, and they went. Yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
the vignettes were 100% hit. And I think I speak for almost all of us in saying that like they felt unanimously cool. Everything up until the entrance was cool, but it almost always seemed like the type of maybe depth of character that felt not that fitting for like the WWE product of the time, which felt I think a lot more reductive, or at least maybe a lot more simplistic. And when you bring anything like from a pre-production element to a live stage, it's going to be that much tougher to sell, especially when it's like a semi-supernatural, type of character like what you had in these three.
And going from the DIY style of vignettes to like these were like and listen, the vignettes, I agree. Like they worked well in terms of the introduction, and there was a big buzz when they were introduced. But once you had the return, like a lot of the strongest Bray Wyatt moments were the lead up to something new when he came back in Toronto as the Fiend and ran through Finn Balor. And that was like this quick match. The entrance got over, the crowd was buzzing. When he returned last year at Extreme Rules, it was always like the introduction was very strong and you had the audience in large numbers behind like alterations. And then it was sustaining that and growing it to the next level.
Certainly, I would classify maybe one of his biggest strength as creative, but especially a creative from like a pre-production standpoint. Or where like he could use the element of filmmaking to his advantage to present his what's in his mind out to the audience. I think it's always been challenging trying to translate that what like what craziness might exist there into a live stage, into like the production routines of a WWE setting, which I'm sure is already chaotic enough trying to get any camera time with production and all that. But to be able to put that, or to be able to like fit it within a live professional wrestling match, has always been a challenge. I think for the company to translate.
And that's why I thought that his pairing with Matt Hardy was really interesting, given those two that were these extremely creative individuals that both had, whether it was in FCW or for Matt Hardy coming off the TNA run, a very hands-on approach to what their vision was and getting that vision as clearly across as they could. And in a WWE setting, like there's always going to be that negotiation. You are not the final editor on your creative ideas, and that can be very stifling for people that are very hands-on and also have a track record of successful ideas, things that they have seen work and having that conviction, but you are ultimately working under an ultimate editor and a team that you have to work with to get your creative visions across. And sometimes those are going to be creative compromises. And that is the system of WWE, is working within a system that hopefully you can squeeze out what your vision is in an entertaining way. And that's a lot easier said than done.
Certainly, yeah. It's almost like, the type of maybe thinking or maybe type of creativity that might be better suited for like an independent production with a small crew, rather than something that inevitably becomes so much bigger when you're talking about a multi-million-dollar corporation. And I don't know how much of that, ultimately affected maybe the translation and maybe some of the, like less than well received things that ended up coming about, like some of his really wild and crazy ideas. But God, like when that stuff hit, it hit huge. Okay. And like maybe just even going backwards, or at least starting from the present and going backwards. The White Rabbit campaign was remarkable, and something that I don't think we've ever seen in professional wrestling up until this point, that made incredible use and completely understood how a modern professional wrestling fan interacts with pro wrestling. How an internet fan might interact with the product of professional wrestling. That seemed completely different from anything that you've seen on the
Dude,
other
it was
parts of
super
the show.
ambitious. Like if you had described this idea to me of how they were going to market this, I would not have been high on this in terms of, I just feel this would have been so complicated for people to follow. And it was the opposite. Like this, and we saw the result. Like this was not just a segment of your audience online that was getting into this. Like we saw, like when they teased, there was a week in September that they were teasing the return of Bray Wyatt, and didn't outright state it, but it was very implied. And you saw a giant, it was like a 15% spike in viewership that week for SmackDown, thinking he was coming with, I think it was like 9:23 p.m. on 9:23, something like that. That was the clue. And it came and went, and there was nothing. But man, there was this huge spike, and you saw it like even in the quarters. Like that was Bray Wyatt that you attributed that to.
This was catering to, an audience that I think is of the similar type to like look up, WandaVision Easter eggs. Looking at every object in the background, trying to see what meaning the directors or the producers are trying to like put into it. And more often than not, I think we were overthinking ourselves and getting ahead of ourselves. But I sometimes it went the other way around, where I think a Bray Wyatt, especially through like maybe some of his very cryptic promos, would lay the foundation to a lot of things that even went over like some of the nerdiest fans' heads. And
You're my barometer. If it missed you, then I don't know how much of an audience it was, because
yeah, so
like this was very tailor made, I think, for your tastes.
oh, very much so, and I'm not the only one, like
No,
he became a cult, sort of like, not just a character, but a cult, like, I think, popular influence for a lot of wrestling fans, getting a lot of people maybe back into professional wrestling as a result, because he was doing something so completely different. But that also told you, like, I think the type of creative mind that he was. He was somebody who was always trying to think a step ahead or several steps ahead, of what the audience was doing, of certainly not even paying attention to what the trends were in professional wrestling, what his peers were doing. He was doing something all completely onto himself. And oftentimes, again, a lot of things might have gotten lost in translation. Maybe we'll look back, years from now and think how far ahead of his time the guy really was. I'm almost certain we will, actually.
I think that is certainly going to be where people look back at this, and that was, I think you described it well, of someone who was kind of onto his own, but in order to, like, you are creating this character that kind of defined its own rules and was very removed from the traditional way of presenting, at least WWE in modern times. But ultimately, this character had to fit into that system. And when we saw him as, someone that got, like, just remember this timeline. He introduces The Fiend after weeks of vignettes at SummerSlam 2019. And by October, he's doing that Hell in a Cell match that was pretty panned with Seth Rollins. And then they put the title on him at the end of that month. So they went all in on The Fiend. And then it ends up being a title match or a title run that goes relatively quickly, where he's beaten by Goldberg in minutes to set up Goldberg and Roman Reigns. But like, that was sort of that, you thrust this guy that gets over night one and suddenly he's the champion in like 2 months. And I think it was a very difficult character to book in like a championship picture. And that was a big struggle. And we saw the baby faces, probably none more than Seth Rollins, that were damaged from that. And that became, it was sort of, how do we take this character that has an appeal, that was a huge merchandise seller? Like it had its audience, and there was more than enough reason to work this character into your programming and make it work. But it was also like this weird push and pull that you had both acclaim and friction with your audience at different times. And I think that's why the return last year, everyone gave it a fresh slate, because, okay, this is the Paul Levesque presentation of Bray Wyatt. We saw kind of a Vince McMahon-led creative direction for Bray Wyatt, and I think that also opened it up. Like, how is this in the eyes of a Paul Levesque? And it certainly got off to a good start. And then, you had the pitch black match with LA Knight that was not as well received, and it remained to be seen like what was going to follow with the Lashley program and beyond. But he certainly, like, for somebody that had this amount of ideas and thoughts, no matter how far out there they were, that is always someone I would want to have on my roster. Somebody that is overthinking rather than underthinking and just kind of going through the motions. Like, this was somebody that, listen, your ideas are not always going to hit. Terry Funk is a perfect example of someone. He's regarded for being this wrestling genius, but by his own admission, he had plenty of failures. The key is you learn from your failures and you can identify them as such, and you're not just back against the wall defending every idea you have. Like, that to me is how that's learning in its simplistic form.
This entire thing is upsetting, of course. But I suppose if we're strictly talking about creativity right now in his career, it's a shame that we only got to see that one match as a part of this run, this and it being the Mountain Dew match. I was very curious to see, like, what, I don't think we fully can assess what this latest run was for him, because I mean, it was cut short, right? I have no doubt, like, WrestleMania was going to be something that was very, very unique. But what lessons might they have learned, I guess, from other matches? To me, like, so I recently heard a quote from Paul Heyman talking about how Roman Reigns, happened to be really excited when the idea of pandemic, sort of like Thunderdome wrestling, came about, because it allowed him the opportunity to try a different style of in-ring storytelling. Creating scenes is, I believe, how Paul Heyman phrased it. And you get the sense that Bray Wyatt had a very similar type of thinking, wanting to apply what he saw maybe in film into the product of professional wrestling. But I'd say, unfortunately, like, for the most part, especially when you got into the Fiend character, the landing wasn't necessarily stuck, and there was always a lot of friction in trying to present that horror movie villain in a wrestling context. And I was very curious to see in this current iteration, beyond the Mountain Dew pitch black match, if they were able to find that balance a little bit better. But we won't know that answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at that that return in 2022. The Royal Rumble, that's the only televised match he had. Everything else is dark matches and live events that he did. And it's
Mhm.
only like a small handful of matches. But I mean, there was a reason they got him onto that post holiday tour around Christmas time. Like this guy was, you could argue, at his hottest when he came back last year. And they dragged it out for a long time on television of just interviews, and you were introducing the eventual Uncle Howdy stuff as well, which
Mhm.
was it never got to the point of being revealed to be Bo Dallas, but you would have figured that would have probably tied into the Lashley program in some form or fashion, that would have been attached as well by all of it. So I also did want to ask you, because I mean, you had a very positive reaction to the Firefly Funhouse match. This was at WrestleMania 36, the pandemic year. Well, the first pandemic year with John Cena. And that's one that, I mean, I watched it that night and I did not have like strong positive or negative, but it certainly did not hit me like it did you. But I thought you had a fantastic breakdown of it. It certainly like opened my thinking on it to something that I'm sure I could go back and watch and appreciate in a different way. But I mean, this was a perfect encapsulation to me of the Fiend character. Like, there was an audience for this, and there was an audience this stuff did not hit at all, and that was
Mhm.
the Bray Wyatt character in many ways.
Yeah. I guess in professional wrestling, there are maybe audiences that gravitate more towards the wrestling side and audiences that gravitate more towards the storytelling side. And most would probably be a bit of a combination of both, but I'm somebody who might be even more attached to the story side of things. And I certainly think like a Bray Wyatt as a creator was maybe more catering to the story side of things. And speaking about the pandemic, I mean, it gave them the opportunity or excuse to create something that seemed to be at least as close as we got to the full expression of the type of storytelling that Bray Wyatt and John Cena wanted to tell, in their minds without the shackles or limitations of having to present it to a live audience. And
This felt like a presentation that he was very much given the steering wheel on.
yeah, yeah. And we got a masterpiece. I consider this to be so, like, at the end of the year, we were supposed to choose like our greatest our favorite cinematic match that year. I don't even consider this a match, I consider this a segment, but it's a masterpiece of a segment, and it's a masterpiece of, I think, professional wrestling character storytelling. The idea that you could take somebody who's become this iconic figure like a John Cena and just completely infiltrate his insecurities. I mean, a guy who feels on the surface, I mean, every bit the Superman, but the character of the Fiend was and the idea of the Firefly Funhouse. I mean, I always took it as like, this concept that I guess exists in somebody's mind, and you got to see something that is very ambitious and really difficult to convey, especially to those audiences who prefer their wrestling to be a lot more sports like. But the idea of this creature infiltrating John Cena's mind and entering the deep recesses of it to find what's behind the bravado, what's behind the muscles, why did he decide to bulk up, why has he been so reluctant to turn heel. I watched it and I was amazed, and I was not a fan of the Fiend really up until that point. So when this came about and I watched it, I was as skeptical as any other people. But once I understood the depth of what they were trying to get at, I think it's one of the greatest things certainly to come out of pandemic wrestling, and I think it's one of the best things I've seen WWE ever produce.
Yeah, John Cena wrote on Friday, devastated by the news of the passing of Windham Rotunda. My heart goes out to the entire Rotunda family. Wyndham brought the best out of me in so many ways. I'm forever grateful for the moments we shared. A sad day for all those he reached. Around the world, rest in peace. And yeah, I would have loved, as one of those kind of behind the scenes features, like John Cena arrives at the Performance Center and a camera on him as this is pitched to him by Bray Wyatt, like describing, like, just go with me.
Mhm.
Bring your 2002 Ruthless Aggression trunks, bring an NWO shirt, and just follow my lead. This is what I have in store.
Yeah, I feel like there's some quote like I've seen us speaking about it in the past of him. Like it sounded like he
Yeah.
was responsible for a lot of the creative as well. Like, and so I wouldn't doubt that. I mean, the man is an actor; he's a creative mind unto himself, and um, I have to imagine this was a collective brainchild of his, but of course using like the very unique sort of like frame and structure of what the feed represents.
Yeah. So that's it's a very interesting like chapter during like the beginning of the pandemic, and that WrestleMania, while probably not being your instant rewatch year of a WrestleMania, it is interesting to see like what they made out of that mania with this was on night 2, I believe, and then the first night with the Boneyard match that are probably going to be the presentations that are remembered the most from that empty arena performance center WrestleMania.
Yeah, absolutely. He says, so this is a quote from comicbook.com. I did a unique piece of programming called this is from Cena. I did a unique piece of programming called the Flower Funhouse match, which was a giant exercise in vulnerability. I worked my ass off on that thing, and I thank everyone who was involved because no one does it alone. But it was kind of my brainchild and my creation.
Okay, well, then he had a lot more, input than thought of. Again, it was something that was very, very ballsy to go out with. Like, that is as ambitious as you get because you know that there is going to be a portion of your audience that is gonna pan something like that, but your reassurance is that this will hit more than it will miss. But I applaud that kind of risk taking. Like there's always going to be that balance that you try to strike, and sometimes, like, again, I will always lean towards people to take risks rather than go the safe route to just appease the most amount of people.
And if we are to maybe determine like a final on-screen, I believe like speaking appearance of his, you might look at the press conference for the Rumble as Bray Wyatt's. I guess last time we heard him genuinely speak as himself, and it was a very interesting press conference because it was right after the Pitch Black match. He came out completely without any gimmick and spoke out of character, basically as an actor talking, or at least a writer or creator, behind the scenes talking about the character. And he had a quote that was basically very similar to what you just said, John. Why am I in professional wrestling if I'm not here to do something different than other people, than what came before me? So you have to 100% respect it, because yeah, it's at this point where I think he probably himself was like very aware of the criticism, or maybe he completely turned a blind eye to it. Who knows? But it didn't stop him from creating.
What are you expecting on SmackDown tonight? Do you expect that this is going to be just the full 2 hour, like a tribute show in the same way? Like I couldn't imagine not doing a show that is like a full on complete 2 hour tribute.
It's hard for me to imagine that as well. I mean, I think you'll get, wrestling. Maybe you'll get some like, continued storytelling of whatever current program things you've got. But I'm expecting like a full hour sort of thematic like look back at the guy's career, a very emotional 10-bell salute. I'm positive that will crush, I'm sure, all of us watching. Um, but yeah, like we're talking about an active performer, somebody who was very close to everybody on this current roster, and not somebody removed. I mean, not since, I'm trying to think, like Benoit and Eddie. Like have we? When was the last time like we've had this sort of setting?
I mean, the one, like, it's just the scary parallels to me are like with John Huber.
Yeah,
Like this
yeah.
this just feels so similar in the sense of like here's someone that had been off television, it had been kept very quiet, and then boom, it hits you like a gut punch. Like I remember that so vividly. With his passing at the end of 2020, and here we are, probably in store for a tribute show the next day.
Yeah, yeah. I imagine like the people that are in charge of putting it together are already working feverishly and through like gritted teeth and a ton of emotion to try to put this together. So, Jake's asking if we can put Rewind-A-SmackDown for free tonight. Are you cool with that?
Sure. Yep.
Yeah, so that'll be available for everybody right here at youtube.com/post wrestling. I think we'll even put a call-in link if people want to call in and get their thoughts in, of course, on Bray Wyatt as well. So we'll all watch it and we'll come back here and we'll talk about it together.
Yeah. I think we're going to sign off at this point. Before we go, though, it's been a very tragic week, and I don't want these ones to be forgotten either. Is beyond Terry Funk and Bray Wyatt, also passing away this week was Abe Jacobs, who was a wrestler out of New Zealand who had a very storied career over here in the U.S. And he was 95 years old, so he would be among like the oldest wrestlers at the time of his passing, or at least former wrestlers. We'll have more on him, as well as Rich Landrum, who was a ring announcer for Mid-Atlantic for a number of years, passing away at the age of 77. So, I mean, names that maybe are not as household names among the current wrestling audience, but figures to be remembered as well this week among those that have passed away. We do have a story up on the site about Windham Rotunda if you want to go check that out. And I'm hoping...
when John says story, I mean, he's really underplaying it. This looks to be, and I have not read it yet just because I wanted to keep this conversation fresh, but incredibly comprehensive. And I know John was also in the middle of like studying basically for this Terry Funk obituary he's been trying to write. In the meantime, somehow was able to write this. So I encourage everybody to go to postwrestling.com and read up a little on John's thoughts on the life of Windham Rotunda.
Yes. I'm going to tackle the Terry Funk story. I wanted to have it out today. I'm going to do my best to have it out at some point. There's so much I have on Terry Funk, so it will be out at some point. I can't promise today, but that's my
John. Take your time. Like I speak for everybody. Like you just take a break from it, come back to it. Like you don't, please.
Well, we will have our show tonight, 10 p.m. Eastern time, right after SmackDown. So it will be live here at youtube.com/postwrestling. You can check that out. And then all of our other shows this week. But do go back, watch your Bray Wyatt promos, the vignettes, the Firefly Funhouse. I mean, it is one thing. It's an unfortunate tragedy, but there is so much of these careers that you can go back and visit. But more importantly than any of the career stuff, obviously we're kind of coming at it from that angle because that's the most that we are familiar with the individual. But this is somebody that has left behind parents, a brother and sister, a girlfriend, 4 children. I mean, it's that's the part that's so heartbreaking. And if you go on his Instagram and see all the photos with his children, it really is. That's the tragedy. That is the headline right there, that a father has passed away at 36.
Andy sent a couple super chats here. He says, devastating week in the world of wrestling. Gone too soon. Thoughts and prayers to all the loved ones. Thank you, John Way, for the retrospective. He also says, at WrestleMania 30, the Wyatt family was the coolest thing in the world and could have been the new NWO. Live in fear with the Fireflies is an all-time entrance.
Yeah, that was, I mean, we were at that show, and that was the year to me that Bray Wyatt was the character for so many people, and that was the first Cena match at a WrestleMania. And if you remember, he was so over that in the media box they had these lights for everybody that were mistakenly observed as lanterns, Bray Wyatt lanterns, that some media people just took as mementos, but they were actually property of the stadium that were actually not Bray Wyatt lanterns.
I don't know about that. That was never explicitly stated. They looked like souvenirs to me, and if any media member might have made that mistake, I think I would completely forgive them.
Yeah, that's fair enough on Wai Ting's defense. But yeah,
thank you, Maddie B, for the super chat as well. Or yes.
All right. There's plenty more we could talk about with Bray Wyatt. We'll probably get into it tonight. I encourage people, we will have a feedback thread up. If you want to throw in any questions or memories tonight, we will go through those as well. It'll probably be a very emotional edition of SmackDown. So we will be chatting about that then. So thanks to everyone for tuning in live for this bonus show, and we'll speak with you tonight.